I will say that I disagree also with Emilio Lamo, because of course states are very important, but in my view, people to people is probably the most important revolution in the last century. Why? Because now we have a lot of instruments and tools to be connected. And the state, of course, is very important, and also the companies and all the elements you would like to consider. But in the case of diplomacy, people to people is one of the most relevant revolutions in the world. Think about this. 45% of the people in the world is under 26 years old. And they use, and they live, and they are part of the social networks. Social media, whatever the name you want. So what I mean is that technology is part of their lives. You can do a foreign policy without considering 45% of the world population. In my view, it means you have to change some values, some resources, and some strategies. It's not so easy to say that Twitter diplomacy or tweet diplomacy or digital diplomacy is relevant in the real politics. Think about this bring our girls back, or think about the discussion about the Google Maps. It's not so easy to connect both parts. So if you have a hashtag saying bring our girls back, it doesn't happen. Nothing happens. But in my view, if you have Twitter, if you have social networks, if you have digital media, you can the agenda. And this is the real added value of digital tools. In my view, every, I will say 25 years, someone writes a book entitled something like, "This is the end of diplomacy." I will say again. During the courses here at the diplomatic school, senior Spanish diplomat told me that 25 years ago, more or less, when the fax appears, someone said that this is the end of the Spanish foreign service. So that's the view. But now we have a real change in 2 points. The first one is about transparency. The second one is about connectivity. By definition, right now, new diplomacy is open, is public. You can't do secret diplomacy, you can do nothing without the public opinion, you can do nothing without considering the public agenda. So this is a real change. Of course, there's no a new diplomacy. I will say that this is diplomacy. This is the last 3 feet diplomacy, and what you need is to develop new skills, new areas of competences, and also, why not, more tools to do your job. That's all. I will say that we have 2 types of challenge. The first one is about the government. Be afraid of the government by acclamation, said Edward Burke during the French Revolution. So I think that if you have a lot of Twitter fans or whatever, it doesn't matter. What is really, really important is, do you have a strategy to be relevant in the digital world? Do you have people who understand what is happening with this 45 population in the world? So please don't think about technology, think about people. The second one is about the professional diplomat. In my view, what is happening now is that the traditional diplomacy needs new skills. I will say that we are facing an incremental diplomacy. You need more abilities, more competences, and more ways to connect to the people, probably with a more decentralized, mobile, and flexible networks. That is, as I wrote, that is hacking diplomacy, to transform the way we do diplomacy. So, and that's all. I will introduce you my colleague, Jan Melicin. He's coming from Amsterdam, despite the flight. And he's a senior researcher at Cliggendale Institute in Cliggendale. And he's James Pament, he's senior research fellow at Oxford University, and both of them wrote a lot of books, articles, and really, really interesting issues about what is happening in the new diplomacy and which one is the foreign policy challenge. So thank you very much, and it's your time.
Thank you very much, Juan Luis. Thank you very much for inviting me. Also to Charles, it's a great pleasure to be here again at Elcano. I thank you for introducing us as experts. I don't think we feel like experts, and perhaps we're a bit like ambassadors there, that you keep learning from day to day in this matter that is apparently so easy to understand but so hard to do. I'm not going to be nearly as crystal clear as a French ambassador, nor as witty as a British ambassador, and I have the handicap of not representing an institution. So I cannot say what I'm doing for my daily work, and that should be the story. I have to make up literally what I'm going to tell you here today on public diplomacy. And I have another handicap, and that's I'm representing a think tank. And for those of you who read the New York Times, there have been some critical reports about think tanks, how they depend on governments. I still hope that on the plus side, think tanks are boundary spanners who do not only understand the language of government, but also have a very keen interest in the problems of government and try to help government by thinking about policy innovation. And that's really what we're talking about here today. It's policy innovation, it's public diplomacy as an element of diplomacy. And as has been mentioned on a number of occasions, we're really talking about a practice and a profession in transformation, of which public diplomacy is just a part. Public diplomacy, then we should know by now more or less what it is and how it works, because there have been debates, discussions, literature, a massive literature for over 10 years. So I think the question is not so much how to do it, but rather how to make it work. And there we see economic obstacles, we see political obstacles, we see economic obstacles, and we see obstacles of professional culture. And those are really the challenges, because we all know some of the basic principles of what's been called the new public diplomacy, or a more dialogical diplomacy, a non-state actor-based public diplomacy. So that's where I see a challenge. And that's where we can benefit also from other actors and literally also other worlds. So one could think of Asia. We're not the only ones thinking about public diplomacy. Companies, international organizations, NGOs, there is a lot of expertise in this field. And even within foreign ministry and in a budget-tight Europe, I think on the plus side we could say so many more people see they have to do public diplomacy these days. It's no longer the responsibility of the ambassador and the public affairs officer, it's everybody's responsibility. Public diplomacy, as we've seen this morning, heard this morning, has been mainstreamed also throughout foreign ministries, and as far as it's not happening, we are in that difficult process of adapting organizations to this new reality. The new reality that public diplomacy and diplomacy become very often indistinguishable. And I've heard also from my own foreign ministry in the Netherlands, pretty traditional diplomats saying that quite some years ago. So it's filtering through. It's filtering through that we're here talking about a part of diplomacy. And so in fact, an important discussion is one about diplomatic transformation. Now, it was really difficult for me to think about what to say here today, what to contribute to the discussion at this moment here in Spain, in Madrid. And I couldn't resist the temptation to comment on what the Spaniards know very well, the Victus case. The Victus case, which is actually a public diplomacy incident that unfolded in the past few days between Spain and the Netherlands, where a book launch by the author Albert Sánchez Piñol about Barcelona 1714 was cancelled at the Instituto Cervantes. It was cancelled. It was a government decision to cancel this presentation. It was a political decision to cancel this presentation with tremendous public diplomacy consequences and a tremendous echo in the social media. So I do not want to go into too much into the polemic of this specific case, but I do believe it's very interesting to learn some lessons. And here are a few lessons that I learned from this case. One, it's to appreciate the importance of cultural relations. And that's where, in comparison with my country, Spain has this great advantage, or in comparison with Australia, member of the G20, much bigger than we are, for that matter, has this tremendous advantage of the language as a magnet and cultural institutions. And what is so important about the cultural institutions? Why is the British Council so appreciated? Because it is seen as an arm's length institution, something that is not living under the diktat of government, that can make decisions autonomously, that can program autonomously, and that adds a great deal to your credibility, authority, your reputation of a country. So I think this is a good moment for a discussion about what do you want from your cultural relations? And how important is it that Cervantes is autonomous? But it also shows another element of the work of a cultural institution. The crisis has hit cultural institutions as well. So this is another variant of what was mentioned before, of public diplomacy under very stringent economic circumstances, where people have to be enormously creative to do this heroic work. Spanish readers know that this was quite, and is still quite, a little crisis, the Victus case. To put it in perspective, I dare you to guess how many people were intending to attend the event in Utrecht. I know the answer. 12 people plus 8 people of the Club de Lectura. So in total, 20 people were intending to attend that event. Just imagine, compare that with the damage that has been done. I leave it for you to fill that in. But there is another point here to learn, and that is, I think, that has already been made by Ambassador Manley. It shows very well how important it is to rely on your local network. Your local network is very important. Your local people are very important. And here I have the impression quite a number of people were bypassed from Cervantes within the Spanish diplomatic machinery. And this is the general point, I think, here is free diplomats up. Trust this expertise. Generally speaking, it's one of the lessons that the Netherlands has learned after many image crises, much bigger and much more serious than this one, that indeed it's very important to work with that local network and to rely on your embassies. So when you do that, then what's the foreign ministry for? In the old communications format, that was the foreign ministry dictates what you have to do and keeps everything under control. If the foreign ministry were a person, that person would be a control freak. In the present situation, a director of communications told me, well, it's really no longer the case that we can control information, but we rather have to join conversations. And then the role of the foreign ministry perhaps becomes one to support the embassies with a policy framework, with narratives, with tools, with training, to facilitate embassies and to stimulate those embassies. So very, really, in terms of professional culture, a real change of what the foreign ministry is for when it comes to public diplomacy. In terms of a network model, hub and spokes, the periphery is really what matters and what adds to the strength of your national reputation. Back to the Victus case. As you notice, I don't talk about this case like a Spaniard. I'm not interested in some of the fields and some of the arguments that are going back and fro, but I try to look at this from the view of diplomatic practice. And what I see then is that as a newcomer to Twitter myself, that there was tremendous activity in the social media. But there were also some people notoriously absent in this conversation. And I leave it to you to guess who were absent in this conversation. And that, I think, is, again, this shows that it is very important to be, as Juan Luis said himself, and is practicing really better than anybody I know, anybody else I know on this earth, I'm quite honest. It is very important to learn that, and it was mentioned this morning, to build your personal profile. That were your wonderful words, Charles. This is, of course, you can never, as a diplomat, forget whom you're working for and what you're supposed to do, what you're supposed to deliver, but the personality comes in here through the social media. And where, as opposed to defense, diplomacy never had a face, you don't have weapons, it's easy to show war. It's much harder to show diplomacy, which is the business of words. The social media can bring you so much closer to people. And I've been surprised by talking to young people of the age of my children and younger who say this is actually very interesting. They like to read the personal stories, the personal experiences rather, of ambassadors. So it's a tremendous opportunity to create what foreign ministries traditionally never had, unlike ministries of agriculture. That's a domestic constituency. It's a way to develop your domestic constituency. Fifth point here in my list, reflecting on the Victus case, it seems to me that it would be an illusion to live in a kind of a fairy tale world where you can say, well, we do cultural relations and we do public diplomacy, but we're not going to mess around with delicate political issues. Australia, I'm sorry to single you out again, has to deal with the fallout of tapping into the telephone of the closest very important ally, Indonesia. Spain also has to deal with the issues that other Europeans are interested in. And among those issues are indeed the discussions about what's happening to the regions, what are the ambitions of the regions, what's going to happen with the Consulta in November. Trying to put your head down does not make the issues go away. Public diplomacy is, we see then in the Spanish variant, also pretty complex, very complex compared in the way to it is in Belgium, in the UK, but perhaps in a much even more intense way. And we see here, the Victus case shows that we have rival public diplomacies at work. A very single-minded organization like Diplocat, we could just be silent about this, but it's also public diplomacy coming from Spain. So how to construct your narratives and how to construct a foreign policy, public diplomacy in that very complex environment is a reality you have to face up to. My advice to Spain would be, go and talk to the Belgians, go and talk to the Brits, sit together and see how they sort out those issues, because they will be with you and continue to be with you for time immemorial, or as long as we are on this planet. So that's, and finally then, it's been mentioned before, the Victus case, and I mentioned it myself before, shows indeed that public diplomacy is increasingly something that's needed under budget circumstances that in fact could lead in the old days people to conclude, so we can't do anything because we don't have money. Well, the thing is, you have to do many things even if you don't have money. But it changes very much the name of the game. It also means actually that you become much more creative and much more credible because you work through and others with society. So in fact, public diplomacy becomes here an equivalent of networking, of building relationships, which is the essence of diplomacy, but of another nature. And on the strength of those relationships, you do things where you reach foreign and domestic audiences. I'm going to conclude with 3 points, if I may. Recommendations for Spanish public diplomacy. I'm not a student of Spanish public diplomacy. I'd love to study it more, but my time is limited, and I'm working at a think tank, so also money is very limited. First recommendation, catch up in the digital sphere. And I really like what I've heard this morning, the spirit of this should be done step by step. This is something we have to learn as an individual and as an organization. You have to give it time. It doesn't come with a bang. But when you work on it seriously, you can see this change over, say, a period of 3, 5, 7, 10 years. And in part, of course, it's a generational thing. But not just a generational thing. Because many of the people in this audience with whom I've been talking about this issue today are of my age or older. So there are a lot of very mature digital enthusiasts. Secondly, and that is a question really, I've not worked out how the foreign ministry's public diplomacy relates to the project of Marca España. And this is not very clear in my mind. I've not studied it, so I think it would be going too far to come with my opinions here. But I think it's a relevant question, because I have a feeling that there are two variants, almost two disciplines, two approaches, where one is corporate inspired, very much from the top, laying down models of what Spain looks like, what the strengths of Spain are, and the other in the practice of the foreign ministry, working in a much more fluid and much more political environment. So that's a question I would love to hear from anybody here, a comment on that. Thirdly, which has been a bit of a point in my own work, well, public diplomacy is really an expression of something else. It's epiphenomenal, and the real issue, as has also been addressed this morning, is change in diplomacy itself. So at some point, we may even ditch the term. It's still functional to focus our discussions, but we may even decide to ditch the term because diplomacy becomes increasingly enmeshed with society. There was reference to Consular Affairs this morning, which is another area where we can see very clearly how diplomacy is changing. And some of these key functions of the foreign ministry today, ironically, were seen as not diplomacy only a very recent time ago. Consular Affairs was seen as outside diplomatic activity, something that by necessity you have to do as a foreign ministry. And I could show you a dictionary of diplomacy printed at the end of the 20th century, not very long ago, that talks about public diplomacy as not a diplomatic activity, but something that is propaganda for late 20th century diplomats. Well, I think we've seen a very different picture here. And what helps if you want to think about diplomacy, I think also open the doors, be transparent, invite other people in. And I could give you three models there. One is the Dutch model. The Dutch have invited a committee of outsiders to reflect on the department's diplomacy in very close consultation with the foreign ministry, and the report therefore is not 1,000 miles away of what the foreign ministry itself was already thinking about how to make a better diplomacy. That's one model involving outsiders. The second model would be the German model. There is a wonderful website of the Auswärtiges Amt called Weiterdenken, Thinking Further. The Germans have invited about 50 international experts. I've been lucky to be one of them myself, even though I'm not an expert on German foreign policy, to reflect on Germany's foreign policy and diplomacy. It's a very open discussion. The Germans are taking, Frank-Walter Steinmeier takes the discussion about Germany's diplomacy to German society. A third model would be to help people like Charles and myself, and so to say to a think tank, help us and do a study on how diplomacy is changing, and that's what the Finnish government has done with the Klingendahl Institute. I would like to leave it there, and I hope that one or two of these ideas are useful. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Monsieur.
Thank you very much. I'm honoured to be here. I've really enjoyed the discussion so far, and I look forward to hearing your comments after this panel. Public diplomacy is one of my absolutely favourite topics, but it's such a dodgy concept. It is not a trustworthy concept. We can't cling to it and expect it to explain things for us. It offers so little. And the reason for that, I think, is that really it's a term of budgetary convenience. It's just an area where you can put anything. Plane tickets, cost for a photographer, hotels, posters. Stick it under public diplomacy. That seems to be pretty much how many foreign ministries, how many posts overseas view public diplomacy. It's not a valuable concept in itself, I think, unless we use it to think about diplomacy and how diplomacy is changing. And that's where I think the real value of the term comes in. And I just want to start by picking up on that point. Perhaps the most traditional thing in diplomacy is the ambassador's dinner. The ambassador will invite somebody into their residence, they'll have a policy issue on the table, they'll have some VIPs who've come in who want them to push that issue. They'll bring in perhaps a minister from the host country, they may bring in some business leaders who are interested in that area, they may bring in an NGO or a scientist, a professor with impact in that area. This is public diplomacy, and this is perhaps the most core diplomatic activity you can think of. And the thing about it that I think nobody has really touched on so far is that it's still done in private, but it's public diplomacy. Public diplomacy can be done in private, it often is. It involves bringing in people who aren't members of a government and letting them be part of policy, letting them influence policy. So at its very core, I think public diplomacy is really a discussion about change in diplomacy, and that's where it's most useful. And what we're seeing with the new technology, the social media and so on, we're seeing that principle being broadened. We're seeing people thinking about how can you leverage networks, how can you use openness to your advantage, how can you use public debates to your advantage, how can you use culture to your advantage. And I think as Simon, the UK ambassador, said earlier, what assets do we have? What things can we bring in on this policy issue that can help us? And we need to think of these as tools for achieving diplomatic outcomes. The big problem in the debate, I think, over the last 10, 15 years is that we've begun to think of public diplomacy as an end in itself, as something that has its own reality. It doesn't. And I think what's happened, certainly since 9/11, that period where public diplomacy came back, is that there was a lot of work done on image. There was a lot of marketing techniques being brought in. And the great thing about marketing techniques is that they're very easy to measure. They give very quick and easy results. If I run an event on a topic, I can do a poll of everybody afterwards, and the chances are they will have an improved or developed perception of that topic after I've run an event on it. If I spend money promoting something, chances are people will be more aware of that issue. It's really a very basic cause and effect that comes just with marketing. If my issue is, for example, to teach you all about the importance of words that begin with A, the letter A, so I get a dictionary, I have an event, and I read out the entire section of the dictionary under A, and then poll you, do you have a better appreciation of the letter A after this? You will. And essentially the image work that lots of so-called public diplomacy actors have been doing over the last 10, 15 years is that. And it's a very easy way to prove and demonstrate that you're having an effect, that you're having an impact. And I think the useful part of this kind of image work is to develop a tool set, as I was talking about, the assets that you can use to support diplomatic outcomes. But I think in many respects, we've really lost our way. I think a lot of foreign ministries have become very obsessed with the trade and the investment, the tourism, boosting the education sector, and the way that marketing tools can do this in a very quick and easy and measurable way. The problem is that when you start to think about, well, how do we get political influence by using these tools? When the commercial issues start to glide over into political issues, can we still use these marketing tools with their simple cause and effect values? Can we use them to achieve political outcomes, diplomatic outcomes? And I think a lot of the time, actually, it hasn't really worked in the way that people have expected. The reality is that public diplomacy is incredibly poorly institutionalized in foreign ministries, and this is part of the problem. You have a communications department that will sit in the foreign ministry and has been told to embrace marketing techniques. That doesn't in itself help you achieve diplomatic outcomes. You'll have an edict from the center telling you to create Facebook pages and Twitter accounts for each post, and it always amazes me that you'll have the ambassador doing the tweeting, or you'll have an intern, or the lowest grade communications officer doing the tweeting and the Facebook updates. So you have the most important person in the building and the least important person in the building managing your external communications through social media. It's just bizarre. It doesn't make any sense. Where are all of the desk officers, the people who represent your policy to their counterparts in the country? They need to be involved, in my opinion. And it's an example of poor institutionalization. Many of the policies that have been created to guide public diplomacy are aspirational. The foreign ministries are writing, this is what we want to do, this is what our public diplomacy is going to be, but nobody delivers on it. And so you end up in a situation where there are continual cycles of new public diplomacy policies where we're going to do this, this, and this, and then 3 years later, same thing again, because it never happened. So you end up with policies that are basically ineffective. I think we've also seen, in many cases, individual campaigns where there's fantastic use of public diplomacy. I think pretty much every country could point to some campaigns that they've run that are excellent examples of modern diplomacy using social media, using public diplomacy techniques. But the knowledge that's developed through those campaigns is often a one-off. The campaign ends, and the people go on to other jobs, and that's the end of it. The institution itself isn't changed. But then what you do have, I think, as an outcome of this, is individual champions, individuals who have worked on big campaigns or who have been heads of public diplomacy or communication departments at various points, who go on to other jobs and they take their knowledge with them and they end up becoming champions of public diplomacy within diplomacy and using it as part of their policy area. So all of this points to a very slow, cumbersome process of misusing the idea of public diplomacy, getting very confused about what it's about and how it can help us, and losing any good knowledge, any good practices that are developed through good campaigns, through best practice, losing them and not being able to distribute them through the network. And I think we have generally across the board institutions that have just been very slow to adapt. And that's why, going back to my main point, public diplomacy is most useful when we think about how this can help us reform diplomacy, how this can help us update diplomacy and really bring it into the 21st century. I think in the course of my research, looking at several different countries, several different institutions, I've spotted 3 skills, I think, that repeatedly come up. And I just want to talk about those things as they relate to diplomacy and the role of public diplomacy as a tool for achieving diplomatic outcomes. The first is the dinner party. You have a dinner party, embassies spend so much time on their guest list, so much time on figuring out who should we invite, who can we bring in, how can we bring together a good blend to support our policy. And really social media is an extension of the guest list. I don't think it's any more than that. It's a way of managing who is relevant to your issue. It's about salience, basically. Who is a part of this, who isn't? Who am I going to follow? Who am I going to ignore? Who am I going to retweet, even if I don't agree with what they're saying, because they're important? Who am I not going to retweet? And that basic skill, I think it's just a core diplomatic skill that can just be continued and extended into social media. I think it's also very important to think in terms of these core skills of localizing policy issues. Diplomats basically translate information that comes in from their foreign ministry into a language that the local foreign ministry will understand. The local government will understand. Again, when you're out on Twitter, that's all you're doing. You're sending out messages to an audience in a way that they can understand it. So really, we're talking about core diplomatic skills. It's not strange. There's nothing even complicated about it, really. Secondly, I think we're talking about extending the basic task of monitoring information. All diplomats do. They sit and read off what's happening in a country. They transfer that information backwards and forwards. They represent it to different groups of people. When you're out on social media, that's really all you're doing as well. It's the same thing. Now, things like hashtags, things like ampersands and the various codes that are used in Facebook and Twitter and so on, these are just codes. You learn them and you use them in the same way that you would learn ceremonial codes when you're meeting a head of state. It's the same principle. It's netiquette instead of etiquette. What this means too, though, I think, is that you need to start thinking in a much more open way, because it is a broader group. So some of the best practice I've seen supporting that is to treat your internal and your external stakeholders. So the people who are within government, the people who are in different departments across your government, and the people in your host government and the NGOs and so on in your host country, to treat them all as internal and external stakeholders. Treat them all identically, because you need a consistent message across your own institution, and you want NGOs and you want the local government to understand your message in those terms as well. So it's about establishing codes, establishing norms, bringing people into your ideas and getting them to buy into it, getting them to buy into your frames. Really, I would call it building blocks for co-creating policy. Just breaking it down into very simple terms. There's a really good example of this. Simon touched on briefly the campaign to end sexual violence in conflict, which the UK has been running recently. I did a study of their Twitter feed, which was just a hashtag they were using for a certain period when they were trying to launch the campaign. And the really interesting thing about it is the first 100 tweets, or the 100 main tweets during the launch phase of this campaign, 80 of them, 8 out of 10 of these tweets were done by British actors, whether they were part of government or a minister or an embassy or an individual ambassador. What they were doing was building a network, building a debate, and they were doing it in the open, but they were creating a kind of internal consistency, a coherence to the policy. But they were doing it in public in a way that other people could jump in. So the other 20% was NGOs basically jumping in and using the same hashtag, using the same terms of debate. I just think it's a great example of how internal and external stakeholders, you know, if you're trying to push a policy, you need to treat everybody the same, and you need to build consistency and coherence. Social media is just an extension of the things that you would already be doing as diplomats in your normal business. Thirdly, I think the campaign approach, the idea of running diplomacy as a project, is a really useful way of integrating public diplomacy into diplomacy for organizations that aren't used to working that way. Because you have very clear objectives, you can break those objectives down into smaller parts, all the events, all the activities that you do can be related to those activities, and you can evaluate them at the end. It's a very simple, straightforward way of ensuring that you can decentralize delivery of policy, let other actors come in, let as I was talking about, let others co-create the policy with you, but keep it on track. Stick to your objectives. And this means that you need to allow your own staff to flourish. You need to trust them. You need to trust all those people in between the interns and the ambassadors to go out on social media and participate in this themselves, to curate their own policy areas online just as they do in private. It means you need leadership. You need accountability. You need someone who's actually responsible for a policy and who's running the campaign. Someone who can actually enforce discipline, even among the stakeholders who aren't part of your own organization. So I think the idea of champions, people within your organization who get it, particularly younger diplomats who see it as a way of forwarding their careers, or senior diplomats who have been in senior communication positions, these people are very important to changing your institutions, I think. And the interesting thing, as I was talking about with the Twitter feed, with the 100 feeds the 100 tweets basically following a very similar thing, is that transparency is a disciplining tool. Many people think, they assume that if you're transparent, if you have everything out in public, people will say what they like. They don't. What people tend to do is, because it's out in the open, they internalize what they think should be said, what they think is the right behavior, what are the standards and the norms, and they reproduce them. So in a campaign like the campaign to end sexual violence in conflict, what becomes very clear is that people discipline themselves. If everything's out in the open, very rare that you'll get people destroying the campaign through an errant tweet. They reproduce what's being said. So, just to conclude, I wanted to take on just a small case study, slightly controversial perhaps, a fantasy case study of a country that has an island near it, that an evil imperialist country a couple of hundred years ago came and took and won't give back. if you can imagine such a scenario, you have a diplomatic objective. We want our territory back. And if you run policy so that that message is all you produce, you'll have things like blockades, you'll have hostile situations, you'll have nationalist tensions, you'll have visa issues and things that make life difficult for the people living on that island, for example. If you think about public diplomacy as a way of transforming diplomacy proper, and you think about this in some of the ways that I've been discussing, I think you would instead actually do the opposite. I think you would do everything you could to integrate that island into your country. You would get the young people learning Spanish so that they grow up speaking Spanish with a Spanish accent and they speak English with an English accent. You would make it easy for people to travel backwards and forwards. You would facilitate that, because the stronger the ties are to your country, the more likely these people are going to feel like part of Spain. You would open tourism centres, you would encourage exchanges, you would do everything you could to make the young people growing up on that island feel like Spain is their second home. And in a generation, these people are going to be fed up with applying for an overseas territory British passport that costs a fortune and isn't of much use. And instead they'll just want to get a Spanish passport. And the drive for change will come from them, because they won't really care very much about an island that's far away and doesn't really have much to do with them. So, in conclusion, public diplomacy is a dreadful concept. It's not very useful, but it's a great way of thinking about how to reform diplomacy, and it's a great way of thinking about how to extend normal diplomatic activity to the 21st century. Thank you.
Okay. So, thank you very much for your presentations. They are excellent, but I'm sure you have some questions or not. It's okay? Okay. Some questions? The first one. Do you mind if you introduce yourself?
Work? Yes. Yes, hello, maybe it's easier this way. Yes. It works. Do you hear me well? Yes. Yes, my name is Ricardo Diez-Hofleitner. Thank you very much. I'm the Deputy Director for Public Diplomacy in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. More than a question, it's a comment. It's answering Jan's question on brand Spain and public diplomacy. And thank you all for coming today, both ambassadors, representatives, and our friends have been traveling today from other places. So the answer is very simple. We have a very, very close relation in basically two areas. First of all, and that's the most important thing, it's about the objective. We'll see it after lunch, after the lunch break, but basically I conceive public diplomacy. There are many definitions we have seen, almost as many definitions as speakers. There's a very good video I saw only some months ago, and public diplomacy, you can use a variety of definitions, but in any case, you always find three elements. Communication, you find the second element, which is engagement with normally opinion leaders or actors in third countries, and finally, it has to do with influence. So communication, engagement, and influence have to do with both public diplomacy in Spain. It is not only a rather new concept in our foreign policy, but it is rather new in terms of structure in our ministry. But it has a lot to do with Brand Spain and also with public diplomacy, with our Director General that has to do with it. So first of all, in terms of objective, you saw this morning both the Director of Brand Spain, Rafael Conde, and the Director of the Diplomatic Information Office, Cecilia Yuste. They both referred to instruments. Brand Spain is an instrument of our foreign policy. Our public diplomacy divisional director is also conceived and is working as an instrument of our external or foreign policy as well. And secondly, it is not only, it coincides in terms of vision or of objectives, but it also has structural consequences. Brand Spain has several working groups. And one of those working groups has to do with public diplomacy. And we are one of the 4 Director Generals that support constantly the work of PAN Spain. So we have constantly meetings and the connection is very, very close. So that only to give you a short answer to your question. Thank you very much.
No? Charles, please. Take this one.
Maybe I'm saying something which is totally obvious, but trying to think of practical ways in which you can help our Spanish friends and colleagues. Are there any specifically Spanish challenges that our diplomat friends have to face? And I'm thinking about something that interestingly we haven't mentioned, which is language. Cecilia, for example, tweets in Swedish and in Spanish. As do most, so most Dutch ambassadors will tweet in both languages, Dutch and English. So the point I'm getting at is, although the use of Spanish has become very widespread in Twitter and Facebook, Spanish authorities are traditionally extremely reluctant to use other languages. Interestingly, the British ambassador will tweet in Catalan when he visits Barcelona. It would be almost inconceivable for the Spanish foreign minister to tweet in Catalan when he is in Barcelona, which is slightly bizarre. But I don't want to go into the internal domestic debate about that, because that would lead us to lengthy discussions about the absence of a truly federal culture, etc., and the fact that Spain is multilingual and has several identities. But in terms of reaching your audience, this is really the question I'm getting at. The Spanish Foreign Ministry tweets in Spanish, and occasionally embassies will also tweet in the languages of the host country. What would your suggestion be? What would your recommendation be? Because I think in general, the fact that Spain is a world language, that it is one of the most widely spoken languages in the world, interestingly, it militates against getting the Spanish message out there. Basically because the Spanish authorities historically, traditionally, have been very reluctant to use other languages. I'd be curious to think to hear what you say. Carl Bildt, for example, tweets in Swedish and in English all the time, and he has thousands of non-Swedish speaking followers as a result. I don't think Prime Minister Margallo or the Spanish Foreign Ministry feed has lots of non-Spanish speaking or Spanish reading followers. Thank you.
Do you want to go first? Or? Okay. Well, I think language is an opportunity and simultaneously a problem. One of the things I've noticed with Germany, for example, they have a tremendous amount of money to promote the German language abroad and to promote German research and culture. And often at academic conferences, you'll see Germans, lots of Germans there because they've got lots of money and they can afford to travel. So they're presenting German research, but they're doing it in English. And their ability to participate is actually nothing to do with promoting the German language, and actually runs counter to German interests if you see the promotion of the language as one of their core goals. So I think the opportunity and the challenge for countries like Spain is to actually run in parallel with whichever languages are relevant to the policy issue that they're pursuing. If Spanish is relevant for that particular issue, then they should be working in Spanish. But really, it depends on the network and the issue. And I think diplomatic organizations need to be more agile. They need to think in terms of their agility, their ability to shift funding quickly into projects that are important for them at any given moment. And language is a big part of that capacity to switch language depending on the issue.
I don't consider myself a communication expert in this sense, but it seems to me that it depends on the medium. On a website, it can be very confusing, in our case, to mix English and Dutch. On Twitter, I think it's a different thing. My son exclaims more than once to me, "You receive messages in Turkish or in Finnish." I filter them as I filter between Catalan and Spanish when I go to Catalonia. I don't speak Catalan. I'm there twice a year, and I read things in Spanish because that's the language that's more accessible to me. So I think with some media and with Twitter, it's possible to mix them. And as always in public diplomacy, it depends very much on local circumstances. For the embassy in The Hague, the Spanish embassy in The Hague, English is definitely a very good option. So that could be Spanish and English. You promote your language and your culture, and you use a language that is universally known in the country, and where young people feel very free to use those language almost at near native level. Perhaps more importantly, and you addressed that point yourself, Charles, this morning, is the idiom. You have to, rather than stale messages and official messages, you have to get through as people. You want to reach other people. If there is one simple thing, two simple lessons about public diplomacy. One, it's about creating relationships, and it's about going where the people are. And that's where, in this slightly more polemical case of the book launch in the Netherlands, I said, well, some people were just not participants in the conversation, and perhaps they should have been. So it's joining the conversation, it's the language, but it's very much also the idiom. And I think people generally, and that point was eloquently expressed this morning with the Swedish examples, that people respond to people. And young people have a problem with government, with institutions. Many people don't have a very high opinion of their own government, let alone other governments, so they rather have direct contact. And I find it really encouraging how people are very much interested in what officials do, whilst at the same time they don't like officialdom.
One question.
Ask a question. I don't want to. I've had plenty of airtime today, but I just The question related, there we are, the question related to other actors, and what I actually didn't draw out, which I meant to say, and I want to now pose a question to you all as think tankers. The role of think tanks is actually very important to our government, and we have actually used think tanks, and think tanks have used us. I believe it's mutually beneficial relationship to amplify or to investigate a policy area. In a good setting which is still controlled. You've got a limited audience, so you kind of don't get so much of the circus atmosphere. It's like an ambassador's dinner, in fact. You get experts, so you actually get to the nub of it, because what we find also in government work, government to government, is that in fact you've got to get the right people together, otherwise the discussion's going nowhere, because one side might not know enough about a particular topic. And thirdly, we have trusted relationships, because we're smaller groups within society. So it's like a much more intimate version of the Twitter sphere. It's not, and it's person to person. So governments, and our governments over the years, have trusted think tanks and worked closely with them. How do you see government's use of think tanks? I think think tanks have, for many years, played a very important role in developing foreign policy ideas, some of the most sensitive matters of all.
Shall I go first this time then?
Yes, please.
And I'm working in a think tank. You're at a university. So the inside view, when I look back on more than 10 years of discussions about public diplomacy, I'm going to be very immodest now. I see how some ideas actually traveled on public diplomacy from the world of think tanks to governments. Ideas about the use of non-state actors, ideas about a listening-based public diplomacy. Don't broadcast, but listen first. On the use, on a more the development of a more dialogical public diplomacy. These ideas have been worked out in a very provisional form by think tanks. As Joe Nye from Harvard University said once, think tanks, they give provisional answers to important questions. Then we hand them over to the academics to research them more in depth and to come with even better answers to those same questions. By that time, we've already moved on. Because what's more important in the relationship between think tanks and government is the actual discussion than the written product, because you don't have time to read those written products. You don't have time to read books. The debate, the moment of the debate, is where we can tap into your considerations. So that's where I see that indeed think tanks contribute to policy innovation. I find it very encouraging that we're also being asked by governments to actually do that. Some of the big questions for me and for governments are, how do you network in a fast-changing environment and with reduced budgets, where you become increasingly reliant on outside knowledge and outside access? So that is one project that we're doing right now for the Dutch Foreign Ministry. Another project is, how is the digital domain transforming diplomacy as a profession? The questions are dizzying for all of us. It's not just social media, it affects consular, the question of big data, of foreign policy planning. Probably we need a whole new type of young diplomat in the future who can process data in different way than they could in the past. So we're just touching upon these important issues, and that's where we, I think, are sort of a laboratory, which is sometimes confidential and sometimes not. I've got a camera pointing at me right now, and so, but it is indeed that in this sphere where, for us, and that's why for James and myself, this session is very much one where we learn from you, and in a more confidential setting, we learn from government, and we what we give back to government hopefully develops their ideas, and we can come up with very radical comments and suggestions, and government can pick and choose whatever they like. And we also feel it as our moral obligation to annoy those who pay us, as far as we are paid by government. And that is a relationship that works, in the Dutch case, very well. I have the leeway, the room to be critical of government, because government understands that's part of the way we are related to one another. Think tanks have to move in, like government, in an environment that is changing so fast. I like the expression I read once in the Financial Times, saying that the beginning of the 21st century looks like a compressed century. So whilst academics are polishing their peer-reviewed articles, we simply have to move on, because by the time they're in print, some of that information is still relevant, other is not. Mind you, I'm very sympathetic of academia. I run an academic journal myself, which is fully peer-reviewed. Thank you.
The last question. Okay, thank you very much.
No? Yes. My name is Karim Hauser. I work for Casa Árabe, a Spanish public institution that bridges the gap between the Arab world and Spain. And so for James, I had a question on the stakeholders. You mentioned that we should treat stakeholders identically, and that I'm not sure how that sort of like how compatible is that with the know your audience, and how we could treat audiences differently and that at the same time identically. I don't know if you could clarify that, please. And for Jan, I wonder if you have any place for the role of sport in public diplomacy, in how can sport probably be useful in exerting soft power? Thank you.
So, please, James.
Well, just to clarify that point, I don't mean speak to everybody identically. I mean treat them as stakeholders with the same respect as you would treat any other stakeholder, whether they're internal or external. The actual messages that you would send to them would be different, I think.
To sport and diplomacy, definitely, and countries use their sports heroes for that purpose. On my return from Madrid, I'm going to talk to Spanish diplomats from, to diplomats from Kosovo. I saw them before I left for Madrid, and they told me to carry a message to Madrid that you will already know. What that message is, they said with a broad smile. But in a discussion with them about public diplomacy, they, as a very tiny, minusculous country with no really memory bank as a foreign ministry, no experience in foreign policy, they see their sports heroes as very important. It's really an important instrument. Still, I think when we look at big events, Olympic Games, World Championships, it's often said that this is a very effective instrument of public diplomacy. Research that I'm aware of so far has shown that it's been much more important domestically than internationally. And I could give a Spanish example and a Chinese example here. Spain, look at how Barcelona transformed after the Olympic Games and what it has done for Barcelona as a European magnet. I don't think I know anybody who hasn't been in Barcelona in Europe. Secondly, Beijing, the Olympic Games failed in the sense that China could not deliver an improved image of what China is all about to Western publics, but it was very effective for the Chinese people themselves to be more proud of China and to be more confident as a country that becomes an increasingly important international player. So yeah, there is, incidentally, if I may make a little bit of publicity, there is a special issue on sports diplomacy of my journal, which is called the Hague Journal of Diplomacy. So please give me your card and I will send you the details. Thank you.
Okay. So thank you very much for your ideas, which are really, really interesting. So now it's time for lunch break.